The Fall of the House of Usher is a short story by Edgar Allan Poe, published in 1939, but that's not important right now. The Fall of the House of Usher is a TV series created by Mike Flanagan and released on October 12, 2023. It asks the question, what if you put Succession, Dopesick, and the entirety of Poe's work into a blender, and added one hell of a cast? The result is a bit of a mess, but it's an endearing and addictive kind of mess. Something like a deep-fried Twinkie, but the cream is a monologue critiquing capitalism. The show is generally good, but has some gaping flaws that become impossible to ignore, just like the cracks in the titular House of Usher. We'll start with the weaknesses. Spoilers will abound, so go watch the show if you care about that sort of thing. It's only 8 episodes. The biggest problem is how predictable it is. From the very first scene, we know that all of the Usher kids are going to die. In fact, there are flashes of exactly how it happens. Then at the end of the second episode, one of the children die. At the end of the third, another does, and so on and so on. This means for the next 4 episodes, we know exactly what is going to happen, and then it does. There are a few surprises along the way, but ultimately it's exactly what was told at the very start. This leads to the pace feeling sluggish, despite the other things that happen. The dialogue is snappy, and the scenes move quickly, but ultimately we as the audience want to go from point A, everyone fine, to point B, everyone dead, and we know that's going to happen. This makes the intervening episodes feel like somewhat of a waste, and the events therein inconsequential in the grand scheme. There is also Verna, aka the Raven. Early on she's revealed as a bartender that night that everything changed for the Ushers. It quickly becomes clear she's supernatural, a devil or demon of some variety. The exact sort is never spelled out, but this is all shown to the audience in the first couple episodes. Despite this, there are extended scenes discussing who is attacking the Ushers, insecurity and who the mysterious woman is, and it's all just pointless. These scenes make sense for the characters, but for the audience, it's its own kind of torture. Now, Flanagan is rarely subtle in his messages, many people pointing to monologues and Midnight Mass as the most egregious cases of this, but here the themes become a sledgehammer, smashing into the same anvil over and over until the metal breaks. I'm all for eating the rich, and the Sacklers are some of the most evil people on the planet, who the Ushers represent, but at a certain point, we get the message. The best example of this is Richard Usher, the patriarch of the family, who delivers a monologue about lemons. He says, basically, you don't make lemonade, you sell people on the idea they need lemons. While the idea of the monologue works, he launches into a 2-minute tirade that becomes more comical than effective, and diminishes the overall point. That's another noticeable flaw, the tone. The first few episodes push the Succession aspect, with all the children sniping at one another over-the-top dialogue, and displays of wealth so ludicrous it borders on fantasy. However, once the deaths start, many of those aspects stick around. There is a physical comedy scene where the husband tries to get his chemically burned wife's face to unlock a phone. The tone whiplash is strong and not altogether intentional. Comedy and horror often go together. Scream is one of the greatest horror films for a reason, but it's a very tight line, and Usher sometimes steps over it. This does get reeled back in the last 2 episodes, which in general are a step up from the rest of the show, but it makes the start quite shaky. However, there's actually a huge problem with the ending. In the short story, after the house collapses, that's it, because that's all there needs to be. The show, however, opts for a 5-minute epilogue, which offers no new information, and separates the high point further and further from where the show actually ends. You know the epilogue in the final Harry Potter book? It's exactly like that, with the same level of corny dialogue. So if you haven't watched the show, but plan to, just turn it off with old Aggie standing in the rain. You'll have a better time that way. That was a lot of complaining, but there's a lot of good to the show as well. Despite the anvilicious nature of them, the themes are resonant and impactful. The focus is on the opioid epidemic, and the death and destruction that comes from it, but it's certainly not the only one. Generational trauma and mirroring is another running note, with the same dialogue coming from characters generations and decades apart, which is a commentary on the nature of greed and capitalism and the poison that can come from such wealth. There are also, of course, the allusions to Poe's work, and it would be impossible to list them all. The main characters' names come directly from the short stories, as do most of the secondary characters. All of the deaths are direct callbacks, with some more modern twists, and in general the tone and visuals all aim to evoke Gothic horror. There's also a color theme to the episodes, inspired by the Mask of Red Death with its rooms of blue, purple, green, orange, white, violet, and scarlet and black. Rounding out the allusions to the theme of the 7 deadly sins, and each character's death plays into this. While some are more obvious, Prospero's orgy represents lust, there is debate among others. All of this is to say the themes come through strongly, and ask the questions they're meaning to ask. One of the strongest aspects of the show is the cast. With a huge list of stars, many are Flanagan regulars, but others like Mark Hamill are newcomers, and he gives a hell of a performance as Arthur Pym, a fixer. He's one of my favorite characters, as I've always enjoyed the hyper-competent helper, and he's the right air of authority without intimidation, the promise of violence, but rarely needing to act on it. Then there's Carla Giudino as Verna, who plays both a dozen different characters and one. They're all the same person, but with a different mask on, and the subtle variations make every scene with her a treat. Despite her apparently evil nature, she does care about people and what happens to them. And in the finale, there's an incredible scene with her and Lenore, which definitely touches on being too sentimental, but unlike other moments, doesn't step over the line. As for the horror of the show, there are definite moments of dread and relatively subtle background scares, but those are the exception rather than the rule. There are too many jump scares, and they're the loud and sudden kind. The other scares come from the characters' fates, and there are some solid ones, although most of the time the camera shies away from the gore. Despite this, there is some solid body horror, again in the last couple of episodes, and the effects are very good, with the occasional bit of obvious CGI. The first episode is unfortunately slow to start, and exposition heavy. It's understandable, they have to introduce a cast of almost a dozen characters, plus various spouses, assistants, and establish the 3-timeline structure. With that, there is the present, featuring Roderick Usher talking to his biggest legal foe, Auguste Dupin, in his spooky house. Then there's the recent past, which is where the real story takes place. There's also the distant past, beginning with Roderick's mother dying, but mostly taking place in the late 1970s, as he tries to move up in the corporate world. It's a lot to take in. The themes aren't as prevalent either, and overall it feels like a background scroll in the film. Important to have us understand where each character is at, and their names, but it's not that interesting. It could definitely have gotten away with cutting all the childhood stuff, and just gotten straight to the corporate job, as it didn't really give us any information about the characters. It would also allow the season to be 7 episodes, while trimming down a few other sections, which fits better with some of the imagery they're already using. The second episode is better, and focuses on Prospero, the youngest Usher. Again, we're still learning about the characters, but he's not particularly complicated. He wants, and then he takes. Pure id, representing lust, which is why he decides to have a huge party at the abandoned factory, ignoring every rightful concern. Also a little tangent, but it's odd that all the bastard Usher children are queer, with the youngest 3 being bisexual. The bi characters also all have unusual sexual proclivities, cheating, forcing consent, and orgies, which feels like playing into some harmful stereotypes. The show's not necessarily trying to say something like that, but it feels like a poor choice. It's also a bit of a case of bury your gays, as all the queer characters are dead before the 5th episode ends. Anyway, the end of the party scene has one of the most horrific visuals in the show, as the partygoers are sprayed with acid from the sprinkler system. There's no subtle metaphors, but the idea of corporate greed, blind lust, and byproducts of their own pills literally spraying poison at the guests is definitely one way to get the message out. The next episode deals with some of the consequences, though generally no one cares, highlighting the selfish nature of the family. It does turn out there is one survivor, however, the oldest son's wife, who went to the party in a sort of Eve taking the apple moment, one of the numerous Bible allusions. She's horribly burned, but for now she's doing alright. This is Camille's episode, however, who is the public relations for the family. It shows her competence and drive, but unfortunately as it is her episode, that also means she dies at the end of it. Her sin is gluttony, but not of food or wealth, but of information. Her need to know is what gets her killed, something that Verna taunts her about. Well, she would have died anyway due to magic, but it gets her mauled by a chimpanzee. This is vaguely inspired by the episode's title, The Murder in the Rue Morgue, although that was an orangutan. Next we get Leo's episode, inspired by the black cat. He accidentally kills his boyfriend's cat while high, so then he gets a replacement. The replacement attacks him, and seems to be taunting him by killing animals and bringing them to him. As it's revealed at the end, however, he never actually killed the cat. It just wandered off, and most of the episode was a hallucination. This feels a bit cheap, as while there have been other illusions in the show, they've been brief for a quick scare and not to deceive the audience. Leo's sin is wrath, as the focus of the sins is on their final moments, which he spends swinging a hammer trying to get the cat, before finally plunging off the balcony in a desperate rage. However, this doesn't really fit with his character, who would be more of the sloth archetype. Frederick dies by sloth at the end of the 7th episode, but clearly shows a lot of wrath throughout the show, which makes his death feel contrary to the characters, whereas others seem to fit more naturally. This is where some of the thematic cracks start to appear. The Telltale Heart is another episode with a fake-out, but this one feels more earned, and is overall a better episode than The Black Cat. With the children dropping like flies, it changes from being misfortune to carelessness on the Usher's side. Just like the titular tale, this episode features a noise, but instead of a beating heart, it's a chirping sound much more irritating for the modern audience. While there are times during this episode when it feels like fatigue is set in, the ending is fantastic, with an incredible final reveal. Victorine is the victim here, and her sin is greed. Again, it leans away from the most traditional interpretation, as what she wants more than anything is to be famous. To help create an amazing medical invention, not to help people or save lives, but to be known as the person who did those things, and she's willing to lie, cheat, and steal to do it, just like her father. The next episode is Goldbug, which has little in common with its story, but is instead a tale of envy. Tamerlane sees Verna everywhere, and becomes increasingly paranoid that her husband is sleeping with her. This all plays into Tamerlane's cuckold fetish, which is awkward at the best of times. That, combined with the stress from all of her siblings' deaths, and it's no wonder she goes crazy. This is a decent episode, but sort of becomes lost in the mess of them, and it's just one more predictable death. The Pit and the Pendulum focuses on Francis and his wife. He's been growing increasingly agitated at her for attending Prospero's party and begins to torture her. He brings her home from the hospital and taunts her, poisons her, and in general treats her like an object. One of the best little touches is her bandages, which become gradually stained yellow and red. Finally, he decides enough is enough and takes all her teeth out with pliers. This is mercifully not shown, but it's one of the more evil actions in the show. Due to this, he also suffers one of the more brutal and drawn-out death scenes, which feels fitting. With all the children dead, it's time for the finale. There are confirmations, but no revelations, nothing that really changes anything. There's a great conversation between Verna and Arthur, as he goes all Agent Smith and proclaims that humanity is a virus, and he's probably right. This episode also has an incredible image showing the fallout of the opioid epidemic, as Roderick sits on top of his temple, and the rain outside becomes bodies. Thousands and thousands of bodies falling, and it's still an order of magnitude lower than the actual death toll. Finally, Madeline's fate is revealed, who I haven't really talked about. She and Roderick are twins, both equally cruel, calculating, and callous. She opted not to have children, but he spread his seed far and wide, even though they both agreed to the devil's condition. That's part of what makes him so evil. He knew that his children would all have their lives cut dreadfully short. He even had two when he made the deal, but he didn't care. His selfishness knows no bounds, and it wasn't just the devil that made him do it, or some traumatic event. That's just how he always was. Pure evil, just like his inspiration. Unfortunately, in the final episode, it's also revealed that the Bloodline Curse gets everyone, including Usher's granddaughter, who is pure and good. It seemed like it might skip her, as it went Prospero first, then up the line, but for dramatic effect, she was left to last. Although, she was also kind of doomed from the start, being named Lenore. The scene where Verna claims her is very touching, and definitely pulls at the heartstrings. The final fate of Roderick and Madeline? Not as much. So, is the fall of the House of Usher good? Yes. Is it perfect? No. There's more good than bad, but there are undeniable flaws in the structure of the story, messages that are beaten a tad too many times, and an epilogue that manages to undo a lot of goodwill. Despite this, the strong cast, excellent writing, impactful themes, and powerful imagery make it well worth a watch. I hope you've enjoyed this review. If you'd like to see more, subscribe. Be well.